In the frozen darkness of a 10th-century winter night, the screams of 5,000 dying men echoed across the blood-stained snow of ancient Kiev. Their executioner was not a barbarian warlord or a savage conqueror, but a grieving widow whose calculated vengeance would reshape the destiny of Eastern Europe. This is the story of Princess Olga of Kiev, a woman who transformed unspeakable grief into methodical genocide, who painted her path to power with the blood of an entire civilization, and who, against all logic and morality, would one day be canonized as a saint by the very faith that preaches forgiveness and mercy. How does a mass murderer become a holy figure? How does a woman who orchestrated one of history's most elaborate campaigns of revenge find herself immortalized in golden icons and revered in solemn prayers? The answer lies buried beneath 1,000 years of religious revisionism, political expediency, and the uncomfortable truth that history's saints often have more blood on their hands than its sinners. Tonight we delve into the savage reality behind the sacred myth, where fire and faith collide in the most unlikely of transformations. Picture, if you will, a medieval world where power was measured in blood spilled and loyalty counted in severed heads. This was the reality of 10th-century Eastern Europe, a violent chessboard where Slavic tribes, Viking raiders, and emerging kingdoms fought for dominance with a brutality that would shock even the most hardened modern observer. It was into this cauldron of chaos that Olga was born. Sometime around 890 CE, in the northern reaches of what would become Russia, the Kievan Rus, the loose federation of principalities that Olga would one day rule, was less a nation than a collection of fortified trading posts strung along the great rivers that connected Scandinavia to Byzantium. Bounded by Viking adventurers who had carved their way through Slavic lands with sword and axe, this emerging state was held together by little more than mutual greed and the threat of violence. The rulers, descended from the legendary Rurik, maintained their authority through a complex system of tribute, terror, and calculated marriage alliances. Olga herself likely came from Pskov, a frontier town where Viking merchants traded furs and slaves for silver and silk. Her marriage to Prince Igor of Kiev was almost certainly political, a union designed to bind outlying territories to the central power. But in this harsh world, even political marriages could bloom into something deeper. By all accounts, Olga and Igor's partnership was one of mutual respect and shared ambition. A rarity in an age when women were often treated as little more than breeding stock and diplomatic currency. The Drevlians, the tribe that would soon feel the full weight of Olga's wrath, were one of many Slavic groups that chafed under Kievan rule. Forest dwellers who took their name from the word for tree, they inhabited the dense woodlands west of Kiev, a natural fortress that had allowed them to maintain a fierce independence. They paid tribute to Kiev grudgingly, always testing the limits of their submission, always probing for weakness in their overlords. It was this perpetual tension that set the stage for the tragedy that would transform Olga from princess to predator. In 945 CE, Prince Igor made a fatal miscalculation. Having collected the annual tribute from the Drevlians, he decided to return for a second helping, a breach of custom that the proud forest people could not tolerate. What followed would ignite one of history's most terrifying revenge sagas, a systematic campaign of annihilation that would leave thousands dead, and an entire culture in ashes. The murder of Prince Igor was not merely an execution, it was a statement written in agony. The Drevlian warriors, led by their Prince Mal, captured Igor with a small retinue near the town of Iskarost. Contemporary chronicles describe the horror that followed with chilling precision. The Drevlians bent two young birch trees to the ground, tied Igor's legs to them, and then released the trees. The prince was literally torn in half, his screams echoing through the forest as his body was ripped apart in a shower of blood and viscera. This spectacular brutality was carefully calculated in the symbolic language of medieval violence. The manner of death conveyed a message. By using living trees as instruments of execution, the Drevlians were asserting their connection to the forest, their independence, and their contempt for Kievan authority. They were also sending a warning to any future rulers who might dare to exploit them. What they failed to calculate was the nature of the woman they had just widowed. Olga received the news of her husband's death with an icy calm that unnerved even her own courtiers. She did not weep, did not rage, did not tear her clothes in the traditional display of grief. Instead, she retreated into her chambers and emerged with a face carved from stone, and eyes that promised horrors beyond imagination. The Drevlians, drunk on their victory, made their second fatal error. They sent emissaries to Kiev, proposing that Olga marry Prince Mal, thus uniting their tribes under Drevian leadership. The first delegation of 20 distinguished Drevlians arrived in Kiev by boat, proud and confident in their fine clothes and gold ornaments. Olga received them with apparent honor, suggesting they remain in their boat while she prepared a proper welcome. That night, her servants dug a deep pit in the courtyard. The next morning, the Drevlians were carried in their boat, still believing themselves honored guests, and dropped into the pit. As they scrambled in confusion, Olga appeared at the edge. "Is the honor to your taste?" she asked as her men began shoveling earth onto the screaming ambassadors. They were buried alive, their muffled cries lasting for hours as the earth slowly crushed the life from their bodies. But Olga's performance had only begun. She sent word to the Drevlians that she was considering their proposal but required their most noble representatives to escort her. When this second delegation arrived, the cream of Drevian aristocracy, Olga offered them the use of her private bathhouse to refresh themselves after their journey. Once they were inside, enjoying the steam and warmth, her men barred the doors and set the building ablaze. The chronicles describe how the nobles' confident laughter turned to confused shouts, then to desperate screams as they realized their fate. They pounded on the doors until their hands were bloody, their skin blistering and peeling in the inferno. The smell of burning flesh filled the air of Kiev for days. Yet even this grotesque theater was merely the prelude to Olga's masterpiece of vengeance. She sent another message to the Drevlians, informing them that she would come to their lands to hold a funeral feast for her husband, a sacred tradition that even enemies were bound to respect. She asked them to prepare vast quantities of meat and food, promising to mourn properly before accepting their proposal. The Drevlians, perhaps believing the worst was over, or perhaps simply unable to conceive of further treachery under the sacred banner of funeral rites, agreed. Olga arrived at Hyzerost with a small retinue, playing the part of the grieving widow to perfection. She wept at her husband's tomb, tore her hair, and wailed with such apparent sincerity that even the Drevlians were moved. Then she invited them to the funeral feast. As the mead flowed and the Drevlians celebrated what they believed was their impending triumph, Olga's soldiers, hidden in the surrounding forest, prepared for slaughter. When the Drevlians were deep in their cups, barely able to stand, Olga gave the signal. Her warriors fell upon the drunken revelers with sword and axe. The chronicles claim 5,000 Drevlians died that night, though the number may be exaggerated. What is certain is that the flower of Drevlian nobility was cut down in a matter of hours, their blood mixing with the spilled mead in a grotesque parody of the feast they had enjoyed. Even after this massacre, Olga's thirst for vengeance remained unquenched. She returned with a full army to lay siege to Iskarostan, the Drevlian capital. For a full year, the city held out with its wooden walls and the courage of its defenders, mostly old men, women, and children, as the warriors had died at the funeral feast, frustrating Olga's attempts to take it by storm. Finally, she resorted to one last deception, one that would cement her reputation as one of history's most creatively cruel rulers. Olga sent messengers to the exhausted defenders, claiming she had grown weary of the siege, and would accept a token tribute, 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. The Drevlians, scarcely believing their luck, quickly gathered the birds. That night, Olga's soldiers tied small pieces of sulfur wrapped in cloth to each bird's leg. When released, the birds naturally flew home to their nests in the thatched roofs and wooden eaves of Iskarostan. As they settled in for the night, the slow-burning sulfur ignited. The city became an inferno within minutes. Fire raced from building to building, the dry wood and thatch burning with terrible efficiency. Those who fled their burning homes were cut down by Olga's waiting soldiers. Those who remained died in the flames or from smoke inhalation. The screams of burning children echoed through the night as parents faced the impossible choice between the fire and the sword. By morning, Iskarostan was a smoldering ruin, its population dead or enslaved, its culture effectively erased from history. The Drevlians, as a distinct people, ceased to exist after that night. Olga had not merely defeated them, she had performed a kind of cultural genocide, systematically eliminating their leadership, their warriors, and finally their very homes. She divided their lands among her supporters, sold the survivors into slavery, and impose crushing tributes on any scattered communities that remained. Where once a proud forest people had lived, there was now only ash and silence. But history, as it often does, had a bitter irony in store. The woman who had orchestrated this carnival of cruelty would, within a decade, undergo a transformation so complete that it defies easy explanation. In 955 or 957 CE, the exact date remains disputed, Olga traveled to Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire. There in the magnificent Hagia Sophia, she was baptized into the Christian faith, taking the name Helena. The sources differ on what prompted this conversion. Some claim she was dazzled by the splendor of Byzantine civilization and the sophisticated theology of Eastern Christianity. Others suggest it was a calculated political move aligning Kiev with the most powerful Christian empire of the age. Still others propose a more personal transformation, that the weight of her crimes had finally broken through her iron composure, driving her to seek forgiveness in a faith that promised redemption even for the worst sinners. Whatever her motivations, Olga threw herself into her new faith with the same intensity she had once devoted to revenge. She built churches, sponsored missionaries, and attempted, unsuccessfully, to convert her son, Sviatoslav, who remained a proud pagan warrior until his death. She ruled Kiev as regent with wisdom and justice, implementing legal reforms and strengthening trade relationships. The woman who had once burned a city with birds now lit candles before golden icons. When Olga died around 969 CE, she was mourned as a wise ruler and devout Christian. Her grandson, Vladimir the Great, would complete her work, converting the Kievan Rus to Christianity in 988 CE. As the new faith took root, Olga's story began its remarkable transformation. Christian chroniclers, eager to provide the young church with suitable role models, began to reshape her narrative. The massacres became righteous justice. The deceptions became clever strategy. The woman who had buried men alive became a saint who had brought the light of Christ to a pagan land. By the 13th century, Olga had been officially canonized by the Orthodox Church. She was given the title equal to the apostles, an honor reserved for those whose missionary work was deemed equivalent to Christ's original disciples. Icons depicted her holding a cross in one hand and a model church in the other, her face serene and holy. The blood had been washed clean by the convenient amnesia of religious necessity. Today, Saint Olga of Kiev is venerated across Eastern Europe. Churches bear her name from Moscow to Kiev to Belgrade. Her feast day, July 11th, is celebrated with prayers and processions. Believers light candles before her icons, asking for her intercession in matters of faith and governance. In Ukraine, she is considered a national hero, a strong female ruler who defended her people and brought them into the community of Christian nations. Monuments to her stand in city squares, depicting a regal woman with a cross, with no hint of the vengeful widow who once orchestrated mass murder. This transformation raises profound questions about the nature of sainthood, forgiveness, and historical memory. How do we reconcile the Olga who burned thousands alive with the Olga who built churches and promoted peace? The Orthodox Church's answer is theological. Through baptism, she was born again. Her sins were washed away in the waters of conversion. Her violent past becomes not a source of shame, but a testament to the transformative power of faith. She is proof that even the worst sinner can find redemption. But this comfortable narrative obscures more troubling truths. Olga's canonization was as much about politics as piety. The medieval church needed royal saints to legitimize Christian rule, to demonstrate that God's grace flowed through proper governmental channels. A converted pagan princess who brought her people to the faith was too valuable a symbol to be tarnished by inconvenient details about mass murder. Her sainthood served the needs of the institution more than it reflected any genuine spiritual transformation. Moreover, the whitewashing of Olga's crimes reflects a broader pattern in how we construct historical memory. Every nation needs its heroes, its founding myths, its sacred ancestors. The process of creating these figures invariably involves selective amnesia, choosing which parts of their stories to emphasize and which to bury. Olga the mass murderer is forgotten. Olga the saint is remembered. The Drevlians, having left no written records of their own, exist in history only as the villains in their killer's redemption story. This selective memory has real consequences in modern Ukraine. As the nation struggles to define its identity separate from Russia, Olga has become a symbol of Ukrainian strength and independence. Her image appears on currency and stamps. Children learn about her wisdom and piety in school, while the burning of Iskarost is reduced to a footnote, if mentioned at all. She has become what the nation needs her to be, a strong female ruler who stood up to enemies and brought civilization to her people. Yet perhaps there is something valuable in confronting the full truth of figures like Olga. Her story, in all its horror and complexity, tells us something essential about human nature and the twisted paths that lead to power. She was a woman in a male-dominated world who refused to be a victim, who turned her grief into a weapon that none could withstand. She was also a mass murderer who showed no mercy to the innocent, who used deception and brutality with a creativity that still shocks 1,000 years later. The paradox of Saint Olga forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about redemption and justice. Can someone who has committed genocide truly be redeemed? Does conversion erase the blood on one's hands, or does it merely provide a convenient excuse to stop looking? If we believe in the possibility of transformation, must we also accept that history's greatest monsters might die as saints? And if we reject that possibility, what does that say about our faith in human potential for change? In the end, Olga's story is not just about one woman's journey from vengeance to faith. It is about how we construct our heroes and villains, how we choose which stories to tell and which to forget. It is about the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about the past and the uncomfortable truths we bury beneath monuments and myths. Every society built on violence eventually transforms its killers into kings, its massacres into triumphs, its crimes into foundation myths. As we stand before the icons of Saint Olga, golden and serene, we might remember the screams of the Drivians burning in their homes, the ambassadors suffocating beneath the earth, the nobles roasting in the bathhouse. Not because we should reject the possibility of redemption, but because true memory demands we hold both truths simultaneously, the saint and the sinner, the holy woman and the mass murderer, the light of faith and the darkness it sometimes conceals. The birds that burned Iskarost have long since turned to dust. But their flight path traces an arc through history that we follow still. From the ashes of that burning city rose a Christian kingdom that would shape the destiny of Eastern Europe. From the blood of the Drivians came the baptismal waters of a nation. This is the paradox of history. Our civilizations are built on foundations of bones. Our saints often have the bloodiest hands, and our most sacred stories are sometimes the ones we most need to forget. Perhaps that is Olga's true legacy. Not the churches she built or the faith she embraced, but the questions her story forces us to confront. In a world where violence and virtue intertwine, where today's terrorist is tomorrow's statesman, where genocide can be repackaged as nation-building, Olga stands as a reminder that history is written by the survivors. Sanctity is often a political decision, and the difference between a saint and a sinner sometimes depends on nothing more than who tells the story and when they choose to end it. As darkness falls on another July 11 somewhere in Eastern Europe, a believer lights a candle before Saint Olga's icon. They pray for strength, for wisdom, for protection. They do not think of burning birds or buried ambassadors. They see only the saint, not the sinner. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps that is the only way we can bear the weight of history, by selective memory, by choosing which truths to carry forward, and which to leave in the ashes of the past. But for those who dare to look closer, who can hold the full story in their minds without flinching, Olga offers a different kind of wisdom. She reminds us that human beings are capable of both unspeakable cruelty and profound transformation. That the same hands that sign death warrants can fold in prayer. That history's greatest sinners and greatest saints are sometimes the same person seen from different angles. She forces us to confront the terrible possibility that there may be no deed so dark it cannot be redeemed, no crime so terrible it cannot be transformed into virtue by the alchemy of time, faith, and political necessity. In the end, we are left with a choice. We can accept the comfortable lie of Saint Olga, the wise ruler and holy woman whose violent past was merely a prelude to her sacred destiny. Or we can embrace the uncomfortable truth of Princess Olga, the grieving widow whose calculated cruelty still echoes through the centuries, whose sainthood stands as an eternal question mark over our easy categories of good and evil. The answer we choose says less about her than it does about us, about our capacity for forgiveness, our hunger for heroes, and our willingness to stare into the darkness of our own history without blinking. The flames that consumed Iskarost have long since died, but the questions they raise burn still. In every icon of Saint Olga, in every prayer offered in her name, in every monument raised to her memory, we see not just a woman transformed by faith, but a mirror reflecting our own struggles with justice and mercy, memory and forgetting, the sins of the past and the hopes of the future. She is, in the truest sense, a saint for our times, not because she was perfect, but because she was perfectly human in all its terrible complexity. And so the story ends where it began, with fire and blood and the screams of the dying. But it also ends with hymns and prayers and the gentle glow of candlelight on gold. Between these two extremes lies the truth of Olga, neither pure saint nor pure sinner, but something far more disturbing and far more human. She is proof that history is not a moral fable but a horror story with occasional moments of grace. That our heroes are often our villains in different lighting. And that the only honest way to approach the past is with eyes wide open and the courage to see our saints as they truly were, human beings capable of both the divine and the demonic, often in the same lifetime, sometimes in the same act. This is the legacy of the woman who burned a kingdom and built a church on its ashes. This is the paradox of the princess who buried men alive and was buried as a saint. This is Olga of Kiev, mass murderer, nation builder, grandmother of Christianity in Russia, an eternal reminder that history's judgments are written in blood and revised in gold. May her story haunt us as it should, a warning and a promise, a horror and a hope, a reminder that we are all capable of becoming either the saint or the sinner. And that sometimes, terrifyingly, we can be.